Hey internets, so the latest thing that people are freaking out about is SNAP food benefits running out, as a result of the continued government shutdown. For those few of you out there not familiar, that is just the food welfare program in the United States, which enrolls people into the EBT program, basically allowing them to get some free stuff as long as they meet certain criteria. Most of the time the criteria is simply being poor, but there are some loopholes around that, so it's a bit more complicated. But anyway, the problem here is that people are once again showing that a large portion of the population does not understand the difference between an entitlement and a right, with the common misconception being that food is a human right. And while on a very simplistic level that might sound reasonable, because hey, everybody needs to eat, right? There's a lot of really serious issues that come up when you call it a right. Because food benefits are not a right, food benefits are an entitlement. What is the difference and why does it matter? Well, that's one of the things we're going to go over in this video, but I'm also going to be refuting a common socialist false dichotomy using Voosh as an example. Yeah, I know, it's been a while since I refuted Voosh, but he gives a really good example of this particular bad argument. Another is explaining the problem with entitlements and how they pervert the concept of charity and caring for the poor into something actually quite hateful. And also how there's a lot of data that shows that the current status social welfare system is at the very least in need of some serious reform, due to some very serious, arguably intentional flaws. But first off, this is going to be another self-sponsored video. I do happen to have a merch store, it's got some pretty good quality stuff, and profits really do help out the channel, and I'll also be putting the Taxation is Theft merch on sale for a little bit. Because it is theft, and it's also one of the key issues that makes the distinction between what is a right and what is an entitlement. So a link to that will be in the description below, and let's get started with just that. What is the difference between a right and an entitlement? Well, rights come from the concept of natural laws, which are based on asking the question, who is the rightful owner of certain scarce resources? These are effectively laws that every sentient being understands is needed for society to peacefully function, since reality has scarce resources. For example, the fact that two people cannot occupy the same space at the same time, or cannot use the same resource at the same time. Thus, for peace to exist, these conflicts must be easily resolvable and preferably avoided. Natural law fixes this by dictating that the one who first transforms something with, say, their own labor by their own will is thus the rightful owner. Whereas entitlements, on the other hand, are more like privileges. Privileges are something that requires external labor for somebody else to provide. So another way to understand it is kind of the positive and negative liberty thing. Rights are freedom from things, whereas privileges and entitlements are freedoms to have things. For example, a right would be the right to live peacefully in your home, free from some psychopath coming over to murder you, or freedom from someone coming and stealing your stuff. Those are examples of natural rights. And so when you say that food is a human right, you kind of create a slight problem here, because that's not really a freedom from something, but rather it is claiming entitlement to something. So imagine a world where we say that food is a human right, and person A grows a potato, but then person B wants the potato, but person A doesn't want to give the potato they grew to them. Under natural law, the resolution of this conflict is pretty obvious. The first guy grew the potato, he gets to decide what happens with it. If he wants to give it to the second guy because the second guy is starving, sure, then he should be able to do that. But if he doesn't want to give his potato away, for example, say he needs it to eat for himself, well, then that's also fine, because it's his potato. And yet when you try to say that this is an entitlement, that food should be a human right, you're necessarily creating a conflict here. You're saying that person B should be entitled to the potato just as much as person A, even though they didn't do anything to grow the potato, which effectively means that you're giving green light to the idea of theft. And so this tells us a simple way to tell the difference between an entitlement and a right, which is that entitlements necessarily create conflict and contradiction with other people's rights. Because when you say food is a human right, then that means that the person who grew the food somehow doesn't have a right to the food that they grew, but the person who wants it does. But what about the rights of the other guy? It doesn't really make much sense. So when people say food should be a human right, what they're really saying is something more along the lines of farmers should be enslaved and forced at gunpoint to provide free food, or the grocery store clerk, or quote-unquote society at large, or in the Western world, how it usually currently operates is that it's on the taxpayer's dime, regardless of whether or not the taxpayer wants to fund such a thing. And now the usual retort to this is that, but food is a human need. Everybody needs food. And yeah, that's true, but then you're just confusing rights with needs. If two people need the same thing at the same time, like say both person A and person B are starving, we still need to have rights to decide who gets to have the potato. But perhaps most importantly is the fact that you don't actually need food to be a human human right in order to have a social safety net in order to provide food for poor people. Which kind of brings us to the standard false dichotomy whenever those of us crazy free marketeer libertarians point this out, is the accusation that we just want the poor to starve. So here's a clip from Voosh showing this false dichotomy in action.
The Republicans are advocating on a platform more or less of open cruelty, let the poor starve. And because of that, the end to SNAP benefits, of course, funding went, ended on Saturday. They haven't really been treating that as the political nuclear bomb that it really is. But we don't want the poors to have those anyway. I've seen a bunch of Republicans on social media who have been essentially arguing that it's good the SNAP benefits have ended because it's good that people are suffering. If they can't pay for their food, they can't pay for their food, and that's that.
So yeah, pretty typical socialist rhetoric there, with this false dichotomy being that you have this false choice between either a socialist welfare entitlement system or the poor starve to death. That unless you are in favor of socialism, that must mean that you just want the people who can't immediately afford food to all just starve. Very typical false choice there, because of course there are ways to make the poor not have to starve that are not based on socialism. Because the problem with entitlements or viewing food as a human right in this particular context is that it's an issue between involuntary welfare systems and voluntary welfare systems. That's the third choice that's being ignored here. The possibility of a welfare system, but people voluntarily put money into it. Like, for example, a community mutual aid fund. There's a grocery store nearby me that actually recently started one up. Things that allow people in the community to voluntarily help each other, as opposing forcing somebody else to help. Socialists love to equivocate between these two concepts, the concept of entitlement and charity, in order to try and make themselves look like the good guys. Because, everybody likes Santa Claus. He comes once a year and gives all the kids a bunch of free stuff, and everyone's happy and it's joyful, etc., etc. And that's the kind of optics that socialists are going for. They want to be viewed as the heroes just bringing the people the things that they need to survive. But that is absolutely not what socialists are actually advocating for. They're advocating for an entitlement forced welfare system rather than a charity-based voluntary welfare system. And if you look deep into socialist theory, you'll find out that they actually at many points admit this. They don't like the concept of charity because it hurts their ability to sell socialism. And so the whole sale of entitlements is just one big gigantic grift. Because obviously those of us advocating for a charity-based social safety net, or at the very least mutual aid-based social safety nets, or even insurance-based social safety nets, those of us advocating for these alternative systems are not actually against social safety nets. We're not saying let the poor starve. We're saying that involuntary forced welfare systems are inherently dysfunctional and lead to contradictory incentives, such as politicians designing the system to create permanent dependence instead of actually incentivizing people to get out of poverty. And that's just the start of the problems. Because a lot of people out there, they might look at this and think, okay, well, it doesn't really matter because people need to eat. Food is a human need. So as long as there is a social safety net of some sort, what does it matter if it's a public or a private social safety net? What does it matter if it's an involuntary system or a voluntary system? So long as people are getting food on their plates. And the answer is that when you have it be an involuntary system, a forced system, a rights-based system, you actually end up creating a lot of unintended consequences. And to prove my point, for the rest of this video, I'm going to go into what those consequences are. The first of these being that entitlement-based systems lead to the people, well, becoming entitled. You see, rather than being thankful for the food that they are receiving via a charity or a voluntary system, or being grateful to their community for having a mutual aid fund or something, when you have it be an entitlement system, since entitlements at their core are really just rooted in theft, rather than being thankful for what they're receiving for free, they instead view it as a civil rights victory, as a right that they fought for, and so they deserve this free stuff. And so when people go to use their EBT card, say in the United States again, rather than being grateful for living in a rich country that's able to provide them with this, it's instead viewed as a right, that they deserve this card, with a nice big middle finger to the people who are net payers into this system. And this mentality is a lot more common than you think. If you look up people just complaining about EBT benefits not going through this month, this mentality of gives me this now, you owe this to me, seems to unfortunately be more of the norm rather than the exception. And this is what I mean by what I said earlier, that entitlements pervert the concept of charity and turn it into something that is very hateful and spiteful. Rather than the man receiving the potato from the man who created the potato, giving thanks to him for being kind to his fellow man, in an entitlement involuntary system like this, now it's more of a highway robbery. So instead it's viewed as, you owe me this potato. You owe me this money, because you just do. And once you've given that kind of behavior the green light, you create a really weird thing where it leads to this very obnoxious slippery slope slope where people start to think of everything as a right, because then it's less based on what people need and instead based more on equality. So for example, a common one I've seen is that socialists have been trying to say that DoorDash should be a human right, because it's apparently not fair that it's only the people who can afford the delivery of DoorDash can have food delivered to them from their local finest restaurants. Oh no, that's not fair. Everybody should have that right. And I've seen a lot of liberals laugh and criticize the commies for saying things like this as well, because of course that's absolutely ridiculous. A service like DoorDash can't be a human right. I mean, what if nobody wants to do it anymore? Are we going to start forcing people at gunpoint to start doing deliveries or something? It's ridiculous. But what people don't realize is that that is actually just the logical conclusion of what happens when you give in to the communists' first claim. When you've accepted that whatever they want or claim that they need is a human right, then they're just going to keep asking for more and more quote-unquote rights that aren't actually rights at all. That is the problem that happens when you don't just reject the whole concept on principle. And so that's just another reason why there needs to be a very thick line between what is considered an entitlement and what is considered a right. Because if you don't, then eventually the commies are just going to say that everything should be their right. And then on the flip side, these mandatory welfare systems, in addition to making the receivers feel entitled, it also breeds resentment within net payers of the welfare for the people who don't want to be paying for it, but are forced to pay for it anyways. For instance, much of the rest of Vosh's video was him just going over various clips of people making fun of people on EBT and his audience lamenting about how these people are demons and such selfish, greedy jerks. So just like there are people out there who think they deserve welfare and are acting entitled to it on camera, there are also people making fun of the people acting entitled in bad taste. But the thing that socialists don't realize here is that this is just another expected outcome of involuntary welfare, because it's not charity, it's theft. Roughly 12% of Americans are on SNAP, so what the state is effectively doing is just stealing from the 88% of the population that is not on SNAP and giving it to the others. Now, when it comes to charity and actually voluntarily giving to people who are less fortunate, well, that usually makes people feel good because they're voluntarily helping someone in need. But when someone's stealing from you, well, it's a completely different story. And that's why you see all this resentment. And pretty much anybody could figure this out if you just think about it for a few minutes or so. Imagine if your neighbor living next door to you needs some food and you decide to voluntarily give him $20, versus imagine if the neighbor broke into your house and stole your money. I mean, you're obviously going to have a very different feeling about those two different scenarios. And so that's why we're seeing so much negativity surrounding this subject. Anyways, the next problem is the welfare trap. Because one very interesting difference between private mutual aid funds and public welfare schemes is that mutual aid community-based things like this, they don't really have welfare traps. You only see that in involuntary entitlement-based socialist schemes. And why is that? Well, first, for those of you who are not familiar with this problem, a welfare trap occurs when a person who is eligible to receive benefits suddenly becomes ineligible. And this leads them to a situation where they actually have access to less goods and services than before they lost eligibility. And this is generally due to the welfare system not having a way to phase someone out of it. So for example, say eligibility requires someone to earn no more than $20,000 a year, and the welfare benefit is providing them with something that is worth $10,000 a year. Well, in that case, what's going to happen to this person if they get offered a raise at their job to make, say, $25,000 a year? Or say they have an opportunity to work more hours or find a better career path, but they can't find a job that gives them more value than the welfare benefit they're receiving is giving them at the very least. Or what if they just feel that they can't get that kind of job? Well, the unfortunate answer is that this person will be incentivized to turn down the offer to earn more. They find themselves in this insane position where it's not worth the risk going for an opportunity for a better life, which would normally just be completely irrational. But that's what welfare traps do. It's when people who are receiving welfare become incentivized to basically stay poor and stay dependent on the system. And there's pretty good data suggesting that at the very least there's about 10% of people on welfare systems who fall into this kind of trap. And that's a severe lowball estimate. Because since it's incentive-based, it's actually very difficult to quantify that kind of data. The actual extent of this problem is almost unimaginable, especially when you look at welfare systems in the US and where they fall off. Like one study from Daniel Mitchell showing that someone who's earning $29,000, if they are stacking multiple welfare benefits, can actually be better off than somebody earning $69,000. That's a huge freaking cliff. But even if somebody is not on the maximum amount of welfare benefits, there's even smaller welfare cliffs that are still pretty substantial. Like if a person is on both Medicaid and SNAP for food benefits, and that person earns $29,000 or so. Well, they're still going to be incentivized to not take any better work until they can at least secure earning about $37,000. So you can see the problem is very pervasive and common, but the absolute weirdest thing about this problem is how obviously easy it would be to fix it. Anybody just using simple middle school 6th grade math can figure out that all you would have to do would be to make it so that the welfare systems decay at a constant rate based on income, instead of people just suddenly losing eligibility at random points. Like, for example, if the welfare benefit, instead of vanishing at 20K, the benefit payout decayed at a rate of 10% of their earnings past 15K. Well, that would make it so that no matter what, they would be always better off earning more money. Like if everybody in the United States got $100 of UBI a month, and it decayed at, say, a penny for every dollar each person earns, well, that would make it so that at no point in time would a person be getting less money from their benefit in a way that they wouldn't be better off just earning more money at their actual work. At no point in time would the person be in a position where they are incentivized to reject a better career opportunity or a better life. And yet, when we look at these entitlement-based welfare systems in the US, we see that some of these benefits often do decay a little bit, but then they all completely cut off and people lose eligibility at, again, some random arbitrary point of income. Why? Are the politicians and bureaucrats in charge of this just dumb and don't understand basic math? Well, obviously, of course not. Of course they understand it. And they've had many years to fix it, but they keep it this way anyways. And again, why is that? Well, unfortunately, the reason is that it's most likely intentional. Because when a politician in charge of a welfare program that is non-voluntary, well, what happens? How do they get funding for that? Well, again, they can just force people to pay for it. Because of course, the money for the benefit is not coming out of the politician's individual pocket. No, it's coming out of the pocket of the taxpayer, whether they like it or not. So the politician or the bureaucrat in charge of the program, they don't have to worry about personal loss to them. What they have to worry about is whether or not the program is justified. And what's one simple way to do that? Well, to get as many people stuck in it as you possibly can. And so they design in these welfare cliffs in order to trap people into poverty, making them dependent on the state, and so thus they continually keep voting to keep that politician in power. And so in a very disgusting twist, the politician actually benefits from those people staying in poverty. And of course, the state can then use this to justify higher taxation on the people who are net payers already, because more people are in the system. More people are stuck below the welfare line. And so it just keeps ballooning and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is, of course, not the incentive with a voluntary welfare system. In, say, a mutual aid benefit, since you can't force people to be net payers, in order to keep the funds going, in order for it to be economically viable, you want people to get out of poverty as quickly as possible. And so mutual aid society benefits, they're usually either temporary or designed in such a way to lift people out of poverty, or they decay at a very specific rate, as opposed to intentionally trying to make people permanent dependents on the system. And this thus reveals another very big problem with the difference between entitlements and rights, and the consequences of confusing the two. Entitlements actually encourage people to do things that don't make any economic sense. Another issue is that entitlements create a problem when it comes to immigration. Because normally with immigration, when you have a social safety net that is based on freedom of association, immigrants can't just come in and immediately claim benefits. And so the result of that is that you end up attracting better immigrants with higher education that are actually coming to the country with something to offer, rather than trying to get something out of it. And yet when you have a whole bunch of these involuntary welfare entitlement programs, then the opposite occurs. Then you end up attracting immigrants who are just coming for the gibs. And this is actually a bigger problem than much of the data out there shows, because a lot of the data just looks at it from the standpoint of how many immigrants are getting welfare benefits and how many citizens are getting welfare benefits. Well, that doesn't account for one very obvious and actually quite common scenario, which is that when two poor immigrant parents come in, have an anchor baby, and then funnel a bunch of welfare benefits through their baby. Because in that scenario, the benefit is technically being provided to a US citizen, but because these benefits take an entire household into account, you could actually end up with a situation where it's mostly immigrants that are receiving the actual benefit. And indeed, studies that look at welfare use by household status, like this one from the Center for Immigration Studies, quite consistently show that immigrants are indeed using a lot of welfare. Like in New York, something around 70 to 68% of immigrant households are using some kind of welfare system. That is an insane number. especially when you consider again that the problem is likely worse than what's suggested because a lot of these numbers are kind of kept low by certain systems. Like, for example, technically illegal immigrants aren't supposed to be on various welfare benefits, but in some states, like the state I live in Oregon, they don't really do their due diligence in making sure that the people who are applying for things like SNAP actually are who they say they are. And so naturally, if you don't actually have to prove that you are legally entitled to a benefit, people can just lie on their application and get the benefit anyway. That's the main reason why it's ridiculous to claim that there aren't any illegal immigrants on the welfare system. Because there obviously are, you just have to dig beyond the official paperwork. And this all crashes into another big problem, which is the voter cattle problem. All of these people who are being trapped into this welfare system of entitlement, well, what are they gonna vote for? Well, of course, they're just gonna keep voting for more free stuff because they don't really understand the problem that they're in. The result being that the country is eventually flooded with people who are net receivers rather than net payers, which is the biggest problem with entitlement programs, which is that they're not sustainable because they actively incentivize people to not produce more wealth. Then financial collapse of the system becomes a question of when rather than if. And so ultimately our politicians have been incentivized to create this slow march toward socialism. And this of course creates the biggest contradiction of them all. How can food be a human right if food is no longer being produced? You have to make the food in order to eat the food. It's an obvious conundrum when you think about it, but because it's all trapped up in multiple layers of bureaucracies and different welfare systems, people often just completely forget this obvious fact. When the people who want the potato but don't want to do the work to create the potato are allowed to steal from the people who did create the potato, well then eventually you're just going to incentivize society where nobody wants to make potatoes, period. Because that's really what makes the difference of an entitlement. The problem with entitlements and privileges is that they require the labor of somebody else in order to give you what you want. And that's just another reason why if somebody has to fulfill the desire for you, it can never really be considered a right. It's not just because of the contradiction that creates in that it must necessarily infringe on somebody else's rights if you're basically allowing them to be stolen from. It also just has the problem where it eventually creates a society where nobody wants to be the producers, because why become a producer in a society when you can just become a taker? And we as society, especially those of us in Western society where this is going on, really need to figure a way out of this fast. Because as the current system is going, the national debt just keeps getting bigger, likely to reach 40 trillion soon, and people keep voting for more Gibbs and more problems that cause the debt to balloon. And so while in the short run, yes, it does suck that some people are not getting their food, we really need to ask how we got here and why there aren't enough mutual aid practices in place. And the answer is because people have become too dependent on the government. We really need to acknowledge the fact that the current system is very flawed and designed to create dependence. Even if you don't agree with the idea that welfare should be privatized, it is at the very least in need of serious reform. A few compromises I've seen that have been floated are things like changing the welfare system into a greater negative income tax bracket, effectively creating UBI for the poor that decays at the income tax rate, or simply recognizing that the politicians in charge of the current welfare system are corrupt and have intentionally created a very messed up system designed to keep themselves in power at the expense of both the taxpayers and the poor who are trapped in eternal poverty. And unless people become aware of that, then the welfare trap is just going to keep existing. Other fixes also include just improving the medical industry by removing regulatory barriers that cause increased costs, thus reducing the price of medical care, which would have the second order effect of helping those stuck in the Medicaid welfare trap. There is just so much more that could be done, even if not perfect, would at the very least make things better. But unfortunately, neither Republicans or Democrats seem interested, and honestly, as long as people remain unaware of the problems caused by entitlements, politicians really have no incentive to stop scamming us. Anyways, that is all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and you can also support my content on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or again by buying some merch, of which the Taxation is Theft merch is on sale. Thanks again for watching. That is all.